so I was feeling a bit inspired after my updated Queenbreaker weapon review, which did end up being one of my best performing videos on the channel as of late. A very sincere thank you to everyone who showed up to check that one out. But I wanted to make a build where I could just blind everything. And while there are plenty of ways to apply that status effect, I wanted to have as many as possible at my disposal at the same time. Why? Well, because it sounded like fun, and believe it or not, that's why I play video games. And while the setup that I'm highlighting is made for Warlock specifically, at its core, it's really not too far off from being something that you could try out on any class. Just something to keep in mind. Starting with the subclass, and we are going with Arc. For the aspects, Arc Soul. It's not integral to the build per se, but it never hurts to have an Arc buddy that's dealing passive damage. The more important aspect is Electrostatic Mind. Defeating targets with Arc abilities, or jolted or blinded targets, creates an Ionic Trace. Collecting a trace gives you class ability energy, and makes you amplified. And since we are doing our best to blind everything, there should be no shortage of Ionic Traces rolling your way. For the fragments, first, Spark of Beacons. While amplified, your Arc special weapon final blows create a blinding explosion. Really no mystery as to why we chose that one. Next, Spark of Shocks, where Arc Grenades will jolt targets. Not only nice because of the additional damage, but it's another avenue for Ionic Trace generation. I also took Spark of Resistance for a little bit of damage mitigation. When surrounded by combatants, you're more resistant to incoming damage. Lastly, since we will have a lot of Jolt in play with this build as well, Spark of Ions. Defeating a jolted target creates an Ionic Trace. Now, this may seem a bit redundant with the Electrostatic Mind aspect, but it actually compounds. You can see 2 Ionic Traces pop out of a jolted enemy instead of just 1. This can be pretty beneficial, and you'll see why coming up. For our grenade, any guesses as to which one we're taking? The Flashbang. Upon detonation, it'll blind enemy targets affected by the blast, and for a utility-based grenade, it actually does output a good chunk of damage. As an added bonus, it does have the quickest cooldown of the bunch. For the melee, I like Chain Lightning, it does have a shorter cooldown, and it applies Jolt. For the class ability, I do like the Healing Rift for some added survivability. In terms of our super, I go with Chaos Reach. It never hurts having some additional burst damage in your pocket, and the ad clearing potential that Storm Trance can provide isn't really necessary in this setup. Onto our gear, and for our exotic armor piece, Curveball incoming, Fellwinter's Helm. Powered melee final blows create a burst of energy that weakens nearby targets. Finishers and final blows against more powerful targets increase the radius of the burst and the length of the weakening effect. Now the target debuff that this is applying is a very generous 30%. And something not stated in the perk description, targets affected by this burst will also become disoriented. Now keep in mind that this is not normalized to work with Arc Blind, but the physical effect on enemy targets is the same. And if you'd like to check out how enemy tier affects the size of the burst and the duration of the weaken effect, Light.gg has a very detailed breakdown of what this exotic actually does on their website. For weapons, in the kinetic slot, I prefer a disorienting grenade launcher, but if you do need to cover a champion type that this build does not, so barrier specifically, you may need to part ways with the overarching theme. In our energy slot, the legendary Arc Trace Rifle, Path of Least Resistance. Not the easiest weapon to get your hands on anymore, but hopefully you saved a good one from Season of the Seraph. I roll a triple tap and volt shot on it, and this is essentially going to be our primary weapon. This weapon, paired with Spark of Beacons, is going to give us blinding explosions by the bunches. In our heavy slot, my exotic weapon pick, Queenbreaker. This thing got buffed with Lightfall, and escaped the linear fusion rifle nerf. It now disperses its blinding effect to secondary targets through Chain Lightning, which will also carry some damage. So this is no longer a bottom of the barrel heavy weapon. It's not a meta pick, but it's decent and flows right in with what this build is trying to accomplish. For mods, it's Season of the Deep currently, the artifact is heavy with Arc mods. They'll all enhance this build in some way. Use them while you can. Now next season, when the artifact shifts focus, this setup is still going to be fine. Does the current artifact make this build better? Sure, but the absence of these mods will not leave any gaping holes in the boat that need plugged. For our armor mods though, there are definitely a few that we can benefit from. Arc Siphon on your helmet is going to be handy for orb generation. On your chest piece, if you're comfortable with foregoing resistance mods. Double Arc Reserves mods can really help out with overall ammo economy. And Charged Up will give us 1 additional stack of armor charge. On my legs, I have 2 Arc Surge mods, giving our Arc weapons about a 17% damage boost when we do have a stack of armor charge active. And an Elemental Charge mod so you can get armor charge stacks when collecting Ionic Traces. This is on a 3-to-1 basis though. 3 traces gives you 1 stack. And this is why we took Spark of Ions as a fragment. Being able to double dip on those Ionic Traces can go a long way in keeping our armor charge stacks topped off. On my class item, Copy of Time Dilation, and Special Ammo Finisher, just in case the game decides that it hates me and I have to self-generate some green bricks. All said and done, that's a total of 6 ways of blinding enemies. Each of our 3 weapons, a flashbang grenade, a charged melee, or a finisher. But let's talk about this setup. Did it do everything that I was hoping it would do? Yes and no. Having blind available in some capacity on basically every offensive action certainly wasn't a bad thing. In my opinion, it's probably the second most advantageous status effect that we can apply in PvE, behind Suspend. Rendering enemies non-combative always makes the task of cleaning up the field a bit easier, but in higher end content you're also granting yourself additional survivability and freedom of movement, since obviously the enemies are not actively trying to kill you. And in a team-based setting, you're extending those benefits to your fellow Guardians as well. We're also kitted out pretty well to deal with Overload and Unstoppable champions, since on top of having several different ways to blind stun Unstoppables, we're pretty heavy in the jolt department too. Our grenade, our melee, volt shot on Path of Least Resistance, they all jolt, so they can all disrupt overloads. Not to mention Overload Trace Rifle, which will exit the artifact when the curtain closes on this current season, but it is nice to have as an option here while it's still available. Plus, Trace Rifles in general do work great in a double special weapon loadout. They're an ammo-efficient special weapon that can be leaned on for ad clearing, while taking advantage of the greatly improved heavy ammo drops that comes along with running double specials, which in turn buys you a lot more uptime with Queenbreaker. Now, Bungie has come out and stated that this is a long-running bug actually, and they do plan on addressing it. Until that happens though, double specials are still a great way to roll. But while this build certainly has its selling points, in some situations it does leave a bit to be desired. We are a little light in the single target damage department. Queenbreaker, while it's not dealing terrible damage, its strength does mostly lie with its utility. Like I said in my weapon breakdown, you could do worse, but you could absolutely do better. Then the base Chaos Reach without Geomags, while it is still better than Storm Trance, doesn't post overly impressive numbers in this respect either. So when you get to the point where the only objective left is to focus down the boss, all in all, we're just not positioned very well. Now, if you're taking this build into lower end content, all that blind that we're packing, way overkill. It is more feasible in higher end activities, but innately, this build is just very good at killing shit. So the easier the content, the less the blind is gonna matter. Oftentimes, just the source that's applying the blind is gonna be enough to down low level enemies. Then, barrier champs. We got nothing for them. You do always have the option of slotting in a weapon that does have anti-barrier utility, and while it's not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, we are kind of parting ways with the theme of the build. Also, Fellwinter's Helm didn't quite fit as well as I hoped. Now, situationally, it is a very strong exotic. A disorient and a 30% debuff with a maximum working radius of 20 meters and a duration of 20 seconds if you pull a finisher on a big boy target is impressive. And there certainly were times where I was able to take advantage of it. But in the moment-to-moment gameplay, if enemies were already blinded by another source, breaking position and running in for a close range melee or finisher kill didn't always feel necessary. And that long-standing debuff, while it can be very nice in boss fights where ads are available to proc that weakening burst, that's not always going to be a situation that presents itself. So in the end, would I say that this build was effective? For the most part, yeah. Is it the most optimal way to kit your Guardian out? Definitely not. Did I have fun putting this build together and trying it out? Absolutely. If you're slightly off your rocker and have a few screws loose like me, I hope you enjoy it if you decide to give it a go. But that's all I got for you today. If you did enjoy the video, please remember to leave it a like, and feel free to subscribe to the Ironworker Gaming channel if you would like to catch more of my upcoming Destiny 2 content. But with all that being said, you guys are awesome, and I will catch you on the next one.